Watch this video, take some notes, and answer these questions in your own words. What is a hadith, plural ahadith? Who was Malik? What is the Book of the Well-Worn Path? What are Sahaba, Isnad, Matan, and Sahih? Who was al-Bukhari? What did the scholars in the 9th century and today mean by Sunnah? As you may have noticed last time, following the Rashidun period and into the Umayyad dynasty, the world of Islam was getting quite a bit more complicated. The Ummah was now a caliphate, and beyond that, an empire. All sorts of people lived within its borders: pagans, Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, and increasingly, a small minority of people who called themselves Muslims. Now, Islam, unlike these other religions, was quite new on the scene. It had only been around for about 130 years by the end of the Umayyad period in the year 750. And so, because it was new, debates about what Islam was exactly were very much alive and fiery. We've seen a number of different interpretations of Islam already. We've met the Umayyads, who saw Islam as the mark of citizenship in their new empire. We've seen the Kharijites, who thought Islam was an ideal, and therefore only an ideal person was worthy to be the caliph. And we've seen the early Shiites, for whom God took a special interest in the Ahl Bayt, the people of the house of Muhammad, the Imams. Well, why were there so many different visions of Islam? Let's back up for a minute. When Islam arose, it was in a late antique world that was mostly Christian. And Christians have been fighting over what it means to be a Christian since their religion began 7 centuries earlier. Late antique Christianity is, in a certain noteworthy way, defined as centuries of inter-Christian arguments. One group fighting with another over who the real Christian is. That's why Christian theology has historically been very complicated. Ever try to listen to someone explain the Trinity or the Incarnation? They are notoriously difficult, and people did, and still do, fight over exactly what they mean, because these arguments rose out of the Christian debates of late antiquity. And then Islam arose, and the Quran tried to reject all this infighting with a simple message: God is one, only one. When it seems that God is many, it's because this one God speaks through endless revelations, messengers, prophets, signs, and natural wonders. While Christians were bending over backwards to explain their theologies, the message of the Quran was streamlined and pithy. It could be said in a single line: La ilaha illa huwa. There is no God but Him. So, compared to all the complexities of Christian theology, Islam was a breath of fresh air. Okay, but then what happens when a certain Muslim needs more information about something important? Say they want to know how to pray, or how much charity they have to give, or what to believe about God and His messengers, or how to wear their clothes, or what foods to eat. The simplicity of early Islam's message was certainly useful, but sometimes you do need more details. By the end of the Umayyad period, the first Muslims were generations away, and they belonged to a different age, a different culture, and most of them spoke different languages. So what did Islam mean now? Without a prophet, and with a Quran that spoke to people living in a different era, it wasn't obvious where to turn for answers to your questions. Sure, you could turn to the Quran. The Quran was frozen into a written codex by the middle of the Rashidun period, at very latest during the reign of Uthman, somewhere around the year 650 or so, perhaps earlier. And the Quran did occasionally provide plenty of details on certain matters. But still, the Quran, for theological and rhetorical reasons, was usually kind of light on specifics. The Quran was concerned more with the big picture, as it were. And also, the Quran is only so long. It simply can't cover every possible topic that one would have to know about to lead an upright and proper Muslim life. So, where do you go when you need to know something and it isn't in the Quran? We've kind of met this problem already. When Ibn Ishaq first wrote the Sirah around the year 760, we have to suppose that people wanted to know more about Muhammad and his times. If you want to know something beyond what the Quran says, you can look to the first Muslims for more data. The Quran doesn't dwell much on Muhammad's biography, and it dwells even less on the biographies of the people around him. So, Ibn Ishaq collected the reports about the early Ummah so that the Ummah in his own day could know more about their progenitors. But that still doesn't really solve the problem, because the Sirah is hardly an eyewitness report. Remember, it was written at least 130 years after Muhammad died. And it usually isn't clear where Ibn Ishaq was getting his information. It's usually not apparent one way or another that any story that Ibn Ishaq wrote down was true or reliable. And even in his own day, people criticized Ibn Ishaq's Sirah for this problem. Just because you, Ibn Ishaq, say that Muhammad or Ali or Khadija or whoever said or did something, that doesn't really mean that they did it. As we mentioned previously, Ibn Ishaq wasn't just making everything up. Sure, we can question the reliability or historicity of anything he writes, but he is doing some research. Because there were no books besides the Quran written in the Arabic language, that is, nowhere to look up all this history, Ibn Ishaq just asked around. From time to time, Ibn Ishaq in the Sirah would tell us where he got his information from. I heard this from so-and-so. He doesn't do this most of the time, but just enough that we can trace his footprints a little bit. We can see that he is actually looking for accurate information about the early Ummah a century and a half before he lived. What he's looking for are hadith, plural ahadith. A hadith means an anecdote, something that someone once said or did. A short report of an event, or a moment, or a conversation. In this case, hadith refers to a saying or story of someone who knew about the early Ummah. So, Ibn Ishaq traveled around, gathering up these hadith, these stories and sayings about the first generations of Muslims, in an attempt to find the best, most correct material that he could. It's sort of like when you write an essay, and you include a citation from another author. By putting someone else's words in there, you're telling your reader that, see, other people say the same thing as me, therefore I know what I'm talking about too. A hadith is a recourse to someone who has authority on a matter. But just because someone said something, that doesn't mean that they're right. What if the hadith you hear is just made up? Or the person relaying the hadith to you misremembered it. Or they forgot a crucial detail. 130 years is a very long time to pass information along orally, so it's bound to get at least a little messed up as someone tells someone else, who tells someone else, who tells someone else, and on over several generations. People were skeptical of Ibn Ishaq for just this very reason. Usually he doesn't tell us where he got his stories from. But even when he does, so what? So some random person told you this. How do you know that they're right? The most famous of Ibn Ishaq's critics was Malik ibn Anas. We don't know much about him for sure. We know some legends, like that Malik's mother was pregnant with him for 3 years. And we know some things about him that are slightly more plausible, like apparently he picked the wrong side in a failed rebellion against the caliph and was publicly flogged for it, and walked around with a dislocated shoulder for the rest of his life. We aren't sure where he was born, but we do know that he at least ended up in Medina, the city of Muhammad himself, and the place where the Ummah was founded generations before. It's very possible that Malik was just from Medina, but we just can't really be sure. And Malik thought that Medina was the key to finding correct information about Islam's past and what a Muslim was to do in situations when the Quran didn't explain something. If Medina was the first true Muslim community, chances are what the people of Medina think and do centuries later can be traced back to the first Muslims. That is, what is the precedent, the sunnah, of the Medinans? If you weren't sure what to do, or believe, or practice, or think, look back to the way the first Medinans did it, their sunnah. What was their custom, their way of doing things? Chances are, since they were the first Muslim community and the birthplace of the Ummah, their ways, their sunnah, are what God and his Prophet would have had in mind. The people of Medina knew the Prophet best and spoke to him when he was in contact with God. And so it makes sense that the sunnah of these people in Medina was the best precedent to follow. So Malik, like Ibn Ishaq, asked around for information about the first Muslims. But he went one step further. Malik didn't just ask around. He tried to trace the information back to someone from Medina in its early days, one of the first Muslims, ideally. If the people of Medina did this, or reported that, or quoted this hadith for many generations, and it can be traced back to the birth of Islam, we can say that it's much more likely to be the accurate and correct thing to do, think, or believe. And so Malik, and more properly his pupils, gathered these ahadith into the Kitab al-Muwatta, the book of the well-worn path. This title tells us a lot. Imagine you're lost in the wilderness, and you see lots of footprints on the ground leading in many different directions. What do? Well, you look for where the footprints are the deepest and the ground the most compressed. Look for the well-trodden path that many people have been taking over a long period of time. That, presumably, is the right way to go. And that's just what this book was looking for. What was the knowledge and wisdom of the people of Medina, the oldest Muslim city, the most well-worn path on how to live? That was the sunnah, the customs and practices to live by. Malik's book of the well-worn path would collect ahadith all sorts of important and mundane matters. And it tries to guide the reader back to the first Ummah in Medina more than a century before. Here are just 2 examples from his book that show you how this works. Malik reported to me, from Hisham ibn Urwa, that his father used to rent out his land for gold and silver. Okay, so this hadith tells us that the scribe who was writing it heard from Malik, who heard from Hisham ibn Urwa. Hisham knew his own father would rent his land using precious metals. Easy enough. Malik died in the year 795, and he once spoke to this man from Medina named Hisham ibn Urwa, who died around the year 763 and was born around the year 680. Well, Hisham's father, whose name we don't know, therefore must have been born around the year 650, if not earlier, and presumably, like his son, also in Medina. So this hadith tells us that there is at least someone who lived in the Rashidun period in Medina, in the time when the first generations of Muslims were still alive. And they did this. They rented out their land and were willing to accept gold and silver for it. Therefore, the precedent, the sunnah, of the first people of Medina is that it's permissible to lease out land, and it's permissible to accept valuable metals as rent. It's not just a random piece of information. Malik has shown his reader where he got his information from and linked it back to someone who lived in the early days of the Ummah. Let's look at another hadith. Malik reported to me from Nafi that when Abdullah ibn Umar sneezed and someone said to him, "May God have mercy on you," he said in return, "May God have mercy on us and you and forgive us and you." So, the takeaway here is if you sneeze and someone says to you, "May God have mercy on you," the sunnah, the custom, is to respond, "May God have mercy on us and you and forgive us and you." Well, how do we know we can trust this precedent, that this is the right thing to do? Well, the scribe heard from his master Malik, who heard from Nafi, who heard from this Abdullah ibn Umar. Abdullah ibn Umar, by the way, means Abdullah, the son of Umar. That is Umar, the second of the four Rashidun caliphs, one of the original inhabitants of the first Ummah. So again, Malik has traced out his sources of information in order to get us back to the earliest Muslim community, those who were in closest contact with God, and whose sunnah was the most well-worn path. Follow Malik's principle. What is the best thing to do? Follow the sunnah of the first people of Medina. Well, why were they so special? What marked the people of the early Ummah in Medina as different and somehow more authoritative than other people on how to live? Well, they had a prophet living in their midst, Muhammad. The reason the people of Medina are to be trusted as authorities in all sorts of matters is because they were in contact with someone who was in contact with God. And so the Hadith scholars who came after Malik took this to heart. It wasn't that Medina is just innately special, and that's why you should follow their sunnah. It's that the earliest members of the Ummah in Medina learned how to be Muslims from Muhammad himself, and Muhammad was instructed by God. Therefore, these later scholars concluded, it wasn't about sourcing your information back to Medina. It was about sourcing your information back to Muhammad, God's messenger on earth. So the where isn't as important. It doesn't really matter if the information comes from Medina or not. It matters that you can trace your information back to Muhammad. Well, then what you need then is to get someone who is in contact with the Prophet. These are the Sahaba, literally meaning the companions. The Sahaba were people who were somehow, physically, in the presence of Muhammad when he was alive, and they followed his teachings. That is, they are the very earliest Muslims. The Sahaba, the companions, were the people who, at least once, encountered Muhammad in his lifetime during his ministry and embraced his message called Islam. Now, for sure, most of these Sahaba were presumably in and around Medina, but being in Medina isn't what makes them special. Their words are to be trusted because they had some kind of contact with the Prophet, the ultimate human authority on all things Islam. That's also why later, and still today, when a Muslim refers to the Sunnah, they are specifically talking about Muhammad's customs and precedents. The Sunnah is the way the Prophet lived and taught and ate and drank and spoke and composed himself and dressed and thought and carried out finances and used the restroom and all the other things that one may need to know to lead a proper life. Anything at all. If someone trusted by God lived this way, it's safe to assume that it's good for all people to live this way. And by the way, that's why today, when someone uses the word hadith, an anecdote, they're almost invariably referring to an anecdote from Muhammad himself. Okay, so how do you get to the Sunnah of the Prophet? Malik, and sometimes Ibn Ishaq before him, give us these little chains of transmission where their knowledge comes from. I heard this story from so-and-so, who heard it from so-and-so. These chains of transmission are called isnad, supports. This is the route the information passed orally from one person to another, until you can trace the hadith back to its source. For Malik, the source is one of the people of early Medina. And for later hadith collectors, and most Muslims today, the source has to be the Sahaba, and therefore the Prophet himself. The actual material that's getting relayed in these isnads is called the matan, the matter at hand, the content of the hadith. Ideally, a good hadith is a matan, that is, a piece of information like a story or a saying or a practice, and it comes with an isnad, linking the data backwards in time from the person who wrote the hadith down to the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet centuries before. That is, hadith have two components: the isnad, the chain of transmission, and the matan, the thing that's actually being transmitted. If this matan, through its isnad, can be correctly traced back to the Sahaba, then this is presumably the Sunnah of the Prophet and the precedent of how a Muslim should live and think. The next question that follows from this is, can you demonstrate that a given hadith in question is sahih, sound, that is, a reliable source of information about the Sunnah of Muhammad? If your information is sahih, sound, it means that it's been checked for accuracy and dependability by following the isnad backwards over the centuries until you get to one of the Sahaba, and through them back to Muhammad himself, who is the best authority. You go through the lists, see all the names, who heard what from whom, and see, could these people have actually met each other? Were any of these people known liars? Were these people famous for having good memories or bad memories? Does this information make sense? Could this story possibly have been truly relayed as this isnad says so? If all the pieces check out, then the hadith can be declared sahih, sound, a reliable source of information. By the middle of the 9th century, many Muslim scholars are joining up with this sahih movement, the movement to authentically link everything that you can back to the Prophet. There were Shiites and non-Shiites who made collections of hadith of various lengths on various topics and with various levels of soundness. After all, the more time rolls along, the more the hadiths get passed from person to person, and the more they're passed from person to person, the more they tend to get embellished or misquoted or just plain made up. By the middle of the 9th century, there were hundreds of thousands of hadith in circulation, and there was no real consensus on which hadiths were sahih and which ones could be truly linked back to the Prophet and his sunnah. There were plenty of scholars in the mid-9th century and thereafter who tried to solve these sorts of problems and actually get down to true, sound information. Let's just take a look at one of them. Al-Bukhari. Now, Bukhari is not the first person who tried to find and authenticate hadith, but he's definitely the most famous. Like Ibn Ishaq and Malik did generations before, Al-Bukhari traveled the Islamic world in search of various teachers of ancient wisdom. Over 16 years, he went to Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Persia, and of course Arabia, looking for hadith that could possibly be linked back to the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet. Legends about al-Bukhari say that he gathered 600,000 hadith in writing, and then he went through them, editing them, and whittling down the pile to those he deemed the most sound, the most sahih, therefore the most reliable. In the end, his hadith compendium, the Sahih al-Bukhari, the sound collection of al-Bukhari, only has about 7,000 hadith in it. And of those 7,000, about 90% are successfully linked back to the Prophet through the Sahaba. Bukhari arranged these 7,000 ahadith by topics, and the final product was a written source of prophetic opinions on whatever issue a Muslim might be concerned about, from the meaning to the Quran, to how to bathe, to how to say your prayers, what to do when the sun eclipses, how to hold a funeral, how to hire a worker, how to free slaves, how to hunt, how to understand the ways of God. In each case, all of this could be linked back by an isnad to Muhammad. For example, here is the very first hadith in Bukhari's sound collection. Al-Humaydi Abdullah ibn az-Zubair said that Sufyan said, that Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari said, that Muhammad ibn Ibrahim at-Taymi said and reported, that Aqama ibn Waqas heard, that Umar ibn al-Khattab, may God have mercy on him, heard that, I heard the messenger of God, the peace and blessings of God be on him, saying, the rewards of deeds depend on intentions, and everyone will get rewarded according to what he intended. So, the person who wrote this hadith down, that is, al-Bukhari, spoke to al-Humaydi Abdullah ibn az-Zubair, who died in 834. And he, in turn, heard this from Sufyan, who died in the year 815. And so on, the report was relayed backwards in time until the hadith can be traced all the way back to Umar ibn al-Khattab, the Rashidun Caliph. He knew Muhammad personally, and so therefore he is the source of this hadith, one of the Sahaba. And so therefore, this, in theory, resolves the question. If a Muslim wonders, is it better to do the wrong thing with good intentions, or do the right thing with bad intentions? The Sunnah of the Prophet says, God judges people by what they intend to do. Using hadith collections like Bukhari's, Muslims could increasingly find answers to whatever questions they may have. In a way, the hadith were sort of like having the Prophet living amongst the people again, answering concerns and resolving debates. In time, Bukhari's sound collection, and several other hadith manuals, would take a place of honor amongst Muslim literatures, second only to the Quran itself. The Quran is how you know God's will, but the hadith are how you know Muhammad's sunnah. But still, the hadith collections were not and are not perfect. There are forged hadith, lots of them. And although scholars like Malik and Bukhari tried their very best to check their sources using isnad, that doesn't mean they always succeeded. A hadith can be fabricated. And, for that matter, an isnad can be fabricated too. Just because you say you heard something from someone long dead, there's really no way to fact-check someone on that. And so this ilm al-hadith, the science of hadith, continued on, as it still does today. The fact-checking never ended. There's still heated arguments about who is a reliable informant, which hadith is sahih, sound, and which best demonstrates Muhammad's sunnah. Answer these questions. What is a hadith, plural ahadith? Who was Malik? And what is the book of the well-worn path? What are Sahaba, Isnad, Matan, and Sahih? Who was al-Bukhari? What did scholars in the 9th century, and today, mean by Sunnah?